The wagon creaked like it was mourning her, each wooden groan sounding like a warning as it rolled across the dust-choked trail, carrying her farther from the life she wanted and closer to the one chosen for her. And she sat straight-backed on the narrow bench with her gloved hands folded tight around a small folded paper that named her future husband, like a sentence passed down by men who had never asked her what she dreamed of. The desert stretching endless and indifferent around her, sagebrush and cactus bearing silent witness to a bargain struck in a parlor she would never return to. Her name traded for land security and family honor, when the sound of hooves cut through the dry air sharp and sudden, and she looked up to see a lone cowboy riding alongside the wagon, dust rising behind him like a storm he carried on his shoulders, his hat pulled low, eyes steady, not hungry or leering like others she'd passed, but searching, measuring, as if he already sensed the weight pressing on her chest. He slowed his horse, matching the wagon's pace, and for a moment neither spoke, the desert holding its breath, until he finally tipped his hat and said her name like it mattered, like it was still hers, not something signed away, and asked where she was headed, and the driver answered for her. An arranged marriage 2 territories over, good man, good deal, while she stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to beg, because begging had already failed her once. But the cowboy's gaze never left her face, and when he spoke again it was softer, meant only for her, asking if that was truly where she wanted to go, and something in his voice cracked the careful wall she'd built, the wall that said survival meant obedience, and she shook her head just once, barely. A movement so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking for it. But he saw it, and he reined his horse to a stop, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted, stepping closer to the wagon until he stood beside her like a question made flesh, telling her he didn't know her whole story and didn't need to, that the West was wide and cruel and beautiful and that no paper had the right to chain a human soul. And then he said the words that changed everything, simple and dangerous and impossible. "I can take you anywhere else," the driver scoffed, reached for the reins, reminded her of contracts and consequences, and shame, of the family she'd ruin, and the future she'd starve in. And fear surged up her spine because he wasn't wrong about the risks, because freedom was never free. But the cowboy met her eyes again, and didn't promise safety or comfort or love. Only choice, only motion, only the chance to decide her own direction for once in her life. And in that moment she understood that staying was just another kind of dying, so she stood, skirts trembling the wind, stepped down from the wagon with the sound of finality, and handed the folded paper back to the driver, like a relic from a life that no longer fit, her heart pounding so loud she was sure the desert could hear it. And the cowboy helped her into the saddle with hands that were firm but respectful, as if he knew he was not rescuing her but riding beside her. And when they turned away from the wagon, from the road laid out by other people's fears, the horizon seemed to widen, the sky opening like it had been waiting for her all along. And as they rode, dust and sunlight and uncertainty swirling together, she felt terror and hope braided tight in her chest, knowing there would be hardship ahead, hunger, judgment, and nights where doubt would claw at her resolve, but also knowing that this moment, this choice, was the first true thing she had ever claimed as her own. And the cowboy, glancing back at her with a small, knowing smile, said that every great journey ever told began with a single act of courage, the kind people would one day whisper about by firelight, stories of a woman who refused a cage and a man who offered a road. And if anyone was listening to this tale now, feeling that same pull between duty and desire, fear and freedom, then maybe this was their sign too. Because stories like this don't end here. They continue with every step taken in courage. And if you want to ride along to see where this road leads, to witness how choices reshape destiny and how the wild rewards the brave, then stay with us, subscribe, and don't miss the next chapter of a journey that proves some paths are worth everything to follow. They rode until the sun sagged low, and the desert bled gold and copper across the sky, the horse's steady rhythm beating against her fear like a drum calling her forward. And with every mile the wagon road faded behind them, becoming less a threat and more a memory, though her thoughts still chased it, the voices of her family echoing in her head. warnings dressed as love, obedience mistaken for virtue, while the cowboy kept a respectful distance, riding slightly ahead as if giving her space to decide whether this escape was real or just a reckless dream that would unravel by nightfall. And when they finally stopped near a shallow arroyo where cottonwoods bent like tired guardians, she dismounted with shaking legs, realizing for the first time how far she'd already gone, how there was no neat way back, and the weight of that truth nearly crushed her until he handed her a canteen. Without a word, the simple act grounding her more than any speech could, as darkness crept in, coyotes singing their lonely prayers to the moon. She asked him why he'd stopped the wagon, why he'd risked trouble for a woman he didn't know, and he stared into the small fire he'd built, jaw tight, admitting that once, long ago, someone had offered him a road when he was bound for a fate that wasn't his, and he'd been too afraid to take it, and every mile since had been haunted by that cowardice. So when he saw her eyes, the way they looked past the horizon like they were already mourning a life unlived, he couldn't ride on and pretend he hadn't seen. Her throat tightened, because she understood that kind of regret, the kind that grows heavier with time, and she confessed her own fear, not of hunger or danger, but of waking up one day beside a man chosen for her and realizing she'd never once chosen herself. And in the firelight he told her freedom wasn't a destination but a daily decision, one that demanded sacrifice and resolve, and that if she stayed with him there would be no guarantees except honesty and hard miles. And she listened, really listened, feeling the fragile thrill of being spoken to as an equal, not a burden or bargaining chip. When dawn came, cold and pale, she didn't hesitate, saddling up with hands that were steadier now because something inside her had shifted, and as they rode deeper into the untamed west, through valleys where the wind carried stories of outlaws and pioneers and women who vanished from ledgers but not from legend, she began to feel herself returning piece by piece, not as someone's daughter or promised wife, but as a person whose name still belonged to her. And though danger loomed ahead, men who would search for her, laws that favored contracts over hearts, she also felt something stronger than fear taking root, a belief that her life could be authored by her own choices. And the cowboy, sensing it, glanced back with quiet approval, knowing the road would test them both, knowing that courage was not proven in one bold act but in the resolve to keep riding when doubt crept in. And for anyone listening now, standing at the edge of their own impossible decision, wondering if it's too late or too risky to turn away from a path chosen by others, remember this chapter. Remember that the bravest journeys don't start with certainty. They start with a step into the unknown. And if you want to continue riding with them, through danger, devotion, and destiny yet unwritten, make sure you subscribe, because the road ahead only grows more powerful from here. The land changed as they pushed farther west, the soil darkening, the air thick with the promise of rain, and with each mile the freedom she'd claimed began to reveal its price. Because freedom, she learned quickly, did not arrive gently. It tested. It stripped away illusions. And on the third night they rode into trouble, the kind that didn't need announce itself until it was already too close. When three riders emerged from the low hills like shadows given flesh, their horses restless, their eyes sharp with the kind of interest that had nothing to do with kindness. And her heart slammed against her ribs as she realized how fragile her escape truly was, how thin the line was between courage and catastrophe. The cowboy shifted instantly, calm but alert, placing himself just enough between her and the strangers without making a show of it, his voice steady as he greeted them. And she understood then that bravery wasn't loud or reckless. It was controlled, deliberate, earned through scars she hadn't yet seen. And the men asked questions that cut too close, where they were headed, why a woman traveled without family, whether she was claimed, and each word tightened the knot in her chest because the old answers no longer fit, because she was no longer owned yet not fully free in the eyes of a world that demanded labels. And when one rider smirked and suggested she'd fetch a fine reward if returned to the right hands, fear surged through her like ice water. But before she could retreat into silence, she spoke, her voice shaking but clear, saying she was headed nowhere she hadn't chosen, that no man had claim over her body or her future. And the air shifted, tension crackling, surprise flickering across the strangers' faces because they had not expected defiance, not from a woman dressed in dust and courage, and the cowboy didn't interrupt, didn't speak over her. He simply stood firm beside her, letting her words carry their own weight. After a long, dangerous pause, the riders laughed it off, muttered something about foolishness, and rode away. But when their silhouettes disappeared into the dark, her knees nearly gave out. The truth of what could have happened crashing down on her all at once, and she realized that freedom wasn't just about choosing a road. It was about finding your voice and using it even when your hands trembled. And as they made camp under a sky heavy with stars, she confessed how close she'd been to surrendering, how easy it would have been to let someone else speak for her again. And the cowboy nodded, telling her that strength wasn't the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear decide for you, and that tonight she'd crossed another invisible line, one that couldn't be undone. As sleep crept in, she stared at the fire's dying embers and understood that the woman who'd sat silently in a wagon days ago no longer existed, replaced by someone forged in risk and resolve, someone who would still stumble, still doubt, but would never again confuse obedience with virtue. And if you're listening to this story right now, feeling the quiet ache of a life half-lived, standing at the edge of a choice that scares you more than staying ever did, remember Thisbe, the time they reached the edge of the small frontier town, the kind that clung to survival with stubborn pride and crooked wooden signs. The weight of consequences finally caught up to them, because freedom, she was learning, always left footprints, and towns were places where footprints were noticed, measured, and judged. And as they rode down the main street under the open stare of strangers, storekeepers pausing mid-task, men on porches narrowing their eyes, women whispering behind gloved hands, she felt the old instinct rise in her, the urge to shrink, to let the cowboy speak, to disappear into the safer shape the world preferred. But something held her upright in the saddle, something born from the nights she'd faced fear and chosen. Motion anyway. And when the sheriff stepped out from his office like an obstacle made of law and suspicion, resting a hand near his holster and asking where they were headed, and why a woman matching a certain description had been reported missing, her breath caught, because this was the reckoning she'd known would come, the moment when running met reality, and the cowboy glanced at her, not to shield her but to offer her the choice. And that glance mattered more than any promise he could have made. She dismounted slowly, dust clinging to her skirt like the remnants of a former life, and spoke before doubt could silence her, explaining that she wasn't missing, that she had left, that the marriage arranged for her was a transaction she never consented to. And as the words spilled out, measured, calm, unyielding, she realized she was no longer asking permission to exist on her own terms, she was declaring it. And the sheriff listened, truly listened, his expression shifting from authority to uncertainty, because the law he served had never been designed to handle women who refused to be owned. And after a long pause, he warned her of what she'd face: family anger, social exile, hardship without protection. But he did not force her back, and when he finally stepped aside, the air seemed to rush back into her lungs, the invisible chain snapping clean later, in a quiet room above a boarding house where the walls were thin and the future uncertain. She sat alone for the first time since leaving the wagon, realizing how different freedom felt without an audience, how it demanded responsibility as much as bravery, and the truth settled in. The cowboy had not saved her, she had saved herself. He had only ridden beside her long enough for her to remember how, and when he knocked softly to say he'd be leaving at dawn, not because he didn't care, but because her road was now hers to walk without leaning on anyone else's shadow, she thanked him, not with tears, but with a steady voice, full of earned resolve. And when the door closed, she stood at the window watching the town lights flicker like fragile possibilities, knowing her life would never be simple, but it would be honest, authored by choice instead of fear. And if you're listening to this story and feel that quiet hunger for a life that belongs to you, know this chapter exists for you too. Because courage doesn't always look like escape. It sometimes looks like standing your ground and owning your future. And if you want to keep following stories that remind you of your strength, your agency, and your right to choose your own road, Make sure you subscribe, because the journey toward freedom never truly ends, and the next chapter may be the one that changes everything. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light slipping through the thin curtains like a quiet promise, and she woke with the strange, steady calm of someone who had already survived the worst of their fear. The room unfamiliar yet honest, no wagon wheels waiting outside, no contracts folded like shackles in her pocket, only the weight of possibility pressing gently against her ribs. And when she stepped into the street and learned the cowboy had left before dawn, just as he said he would, something inside her ached, not with abandonment, but with gratitude, because he had understood what so few ever did, that freedom borrowed too long becomes another kind of dependence. And as the town stirred awake, she did something radical in its simplicity. She found work at the boarding house, trading labor for a room and meals, her hands blistering, her back aching. But every task carried a quiet dignity because it was hers. And days turned into weeks where whispers followed her like dust, some sharp with judgment, others soft with curiosity, until one evening a young woman approached her in the kitchen, eyes bright with the same restless fear she once carried, asking in a voice barely louder than hope how she'd found the courage to leave. And in that moment she understood that her story was no longer just her own, that courage was contagious when spoken aloud, and she told the truth, not the romantic version, not the heroic lie, but the real one about terror, doubt, and the choice to move anyway. And the girl listened like someone hearing permission for the first time. Seasons shifted. The town softened around her. Not because it suddenly approved, but because consistency has a way of quieting resistance. And one evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky the same fierce gold as the day she left the wagon, a familiar figure rode into town, dust trailing behind him like a memory made solid. The cowboy dismounting with a small, knowing smile, not to reclaim or rescue, but to witness what she had built. And when their eyes met, there were no dramatic words, only understanding, because both knew this reunion was possible only because she had first learned to stand alone. And as they walked side by side through the fading light, equals now, not savior and saved, the truth settled deep and sure. Freedom is not a single moment. It is a life lived in alignment with your own voice. And if you're still listening, still walking alongside this story, let it remind you that the bravest,